Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Corn Board.
Growing more with less is the mantra of Nebraska's corn farmers, and they're using incredible technology to do it. Soil moisture monitors let them know when their crop needs water and how much. GPS systems eliminate overlaps in the field, saving fuel and money. New hybrids reduce the use of pesticides and increase yields. When you're talking new technology and innovation, Nebraska corn farmers are all ears. Nebraska's family corn farmers, sustaining innovation.
Market Journal, television for agricultural business decisions, is a presentation of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine, and major funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Corn Board.
Welcome to this week's edition of Market Journal. I'm Jeff Wilkerson. We're reporting this week from the 2016 Husker Harvest Days near Grand Island, Nebraska. On this episode, Todd Hultman recaps the USDA September Crop Report. Tamra Jackson-Ziems describes how corn growers can scout for stalk rot issues. Nathan Mueller discusses soybean variety selection, and Rick Funston talks about monitoring cow input costs. Todd Hultman from DTN is our market analyst this week. Based on conditions as of September 1st, the U.S. Department of Agriculture believes the country's growers will harvest a 15.1 billion bushel corn crop and a 4.2 billion bushel soybean crop. Both totals would easily be new records, as would the expected average yields. In its September crop report released Monday, the USDA said it's expecting 174.4 bushels per acre in corn and 50.6 bushels per acre in soybeans. Nebraska's production is still projected to be the best ever in both crops. We talked with Todd here Thursday morning and began by asking for his initial thoughts on the agency's latest estimates.
It was a bit of a bearish gasp for traders, especially on the soybean number. We all knew those crop ratings were high, some of the best we've seen in over a decade, and yet it was still a bit of a shock to see a print of yield above 50 bushels an acre. So that did take the market for a spin a bit there. Also on the corn, I think it was disappointing to many that the yield estimate did not come down as much as it did. We're still talking about 15 billion bushels of corn harvest, and I do have a little bit of concern about that going ahead. But overall, I don't think there's a strong argument that we aren't going to add to corn supplies this fall.
Your question is that, are the conditions good enough?
Yeah, the wide variability of yields that we're hearing from different places. The Pro Farmer Tour rightly raised those questions about it, and I think others in the field have confirmed that, yes, overall the crop does look very good, but there is a lot of variability out there. It may not be as good as advertised.
So how do the September estimates change the balance sheet for corn and soybeans?
Well, it's still very heavy for corn supplies. 2.4 billion bushels of ending corn stocks is a lot for corn. There's no change there. And if there's any good news on the price front, we've already anticipated this the last 6 or 7 weeks. So it's not a big shock to prices, although it is keeping them down. On soybeans, it was a bit more of a shock. I think there were some non-commercials that liquidated their long positions after that report, so a bit of a panic out there. But overall, I think the soybean market has a much better future ahead to find support.
Yeah, let's talk about that. You have a record crop in the U.S., record crops in Brazil, and yet if you look at the ending stocks in the U.S., they're still relatively tight. What does that say about use?
Yeah, if I'm a soybean user, I have to be very concerned about the outlook ahead. We've had about 4 record or almost record harvests from Brazil. We've had 3 big crops here in the U.S. And even after all of that, our ending stocks estimates are not very big at all. Barely enough to cover maybe 2 weeks of world production. So in spite of that streak of good growing weather, which as we all know doesn't last forever, what are we going to do if there is a weather hiccup? As I look ahead to Brazil's new crop that's coming up right now, if we see any downgrade in that crop, any weather concern at all, it's going to throw a serious wrench into our outlook for supplies.
Because of the prices, because of the exchange ratio, what do you think farmers in Brazil are going to do when they come around to their next planting season?
Well, they're actually looking at a pretty good price locally in Brazil right now. So we're looking at an acreage increase of about 2 to 3% this year for Brazil soybeans, and probably a production increase of about 5%. That's what USDA is saying right now, and that's probably not unreasonable to start with. Keep in mind, however, even with that big new record crop that they're going to forecast, that 5% increase, they're still only looking at ending stocks in the new season of 85 million bushels. So that's where I say if there's any production problem at all, we've got a supply problem.
So across the board in Argentina, there are reports that they might not be able to go down further on their export tax, which they had hoped to do. Can you explain why that is and what are the implications of it?
You know, it seems to be a political challenge in Argentina, and I don't know if it's just that they don't feel that they can afford to give up that revenue. Seems to be part of the issue here. But the campaign promise was that they would reduce that export tax 5 points every year. And so this year they were supposed to go from a 30% export tax to 25. As far as we're concerned, a 25% export tax on the gross of a soybean sale is still prohibitive and does not encourage a lot of soybean sales out of Argentina.
Let's come back to the U.S. and talk about your price forecast. Before we do that, just what's happening now, and if you look at wheat prices, is there any correlation between wheat and to corn and soybeans?
Yeah, absolutely. The wheat is the most bearish factor on both of those markets right now, but especially for corn. Not only is it taking feed demand away, but in this current season, it gave us 4 million new acres, which were put into corn. And I'm very concerned that we're probably going to see the same thing happen again this fall as they go to plant winter wheat. Less wheat acres makes more available for corn and soybeans, and so we're looking at more expansion in the spring.
Give me your price forecast and kind of the window that you're looking at.
Well, right now, of course, we're at harvest time, and of course, every year we're Grand Island, it's always harvest time. Prices are depressed when we've got good crops on the way. That's understandable, and that's the way it goes. For corn, once we get this harvest in the rearview mirror and start to look ahead and get the corn stored away to where commercials have to bid up to pull it out of farmers' hands, I think we could see a 40 to 50 cent appreciation early into 2017. For soybeans, I have to say there's much more potential there, and it's walking a tight wire. We could have excess stocks or we could have a very tight supply. The door really is wide open on the potential for soybean prices.
Next week, North Dakota State Extension economist Frayne Olson will join us to look at grain markets. The latest crop progress report from Nebraska's National Agricultural Statistics Service rates nearly 3/4 of Nebraska's corn in good to excellent condition. The state's growers have harvested only 1% of the crop, 3 points behind their 5-year average. Nebraska Extension plant pathologist Tamra Jackson-Ziems says farmers should be watching for stalk rot diseases in certain areas, including dieback causing sudden browning in the upper part of the plant. We talked with Tamra earlier this week near Clay Center, Nebraska, and began by asking for an overview of stalk rot issues.
We're starting to see some stalk rots in different areas of Nebraska, and not in every field, of course, but here and there we are. And people are recognizing that some of the plants are beginning to die prematurely. Sometimes it's entire plants, sometimes it's just the tops of the plants.
Yeah, describe to me what they should be looking for in those fields.
Well, in those fields, that's a good indication there might be an early problem going on. And so we hope that folks will get out and they'll scout in those fields to look for high-risk situations that might lead to lodging later on. And of course, there's a number of diseases that can cause that too.
You want to be doing anything specific with those plants to tell if they have specific stalk rot diseases?
Well, in the field, we hope they do a few things. So when scouting for stalk rot diseases, I would recommend using the push or the pinch test to really evaluate any weakness in that stalk below the ear that might lead to lodging later on. It is also a good idea to know which diseases are impacting those plants. In the past, we didn't think that there was a whole lot of value in diagnosing at this time of year, but now we have more resistant hybrids to many of those diseases, and so there is more value now in the diagnostics side of this.
Is there a need to go out and split stems?
That actually is part of the diagnostics process, and some of that's done in the lab, but some of the clues inside those stalks actually can help lead you to the right answer. For example, even the color of the stalk rot symptoms inside that pith can give you some clues.
What are the high-risk areas?
So there's a lot of situations that we've had, weather conditions, for instance, throughout the year that have led to stress on the crop throughout this summer and spring that create high-risk situations for diseases like stalk rot diseases. Well, the pathogens that cause all of these fungal stalk rots are in the field every year, all the time. And so the plants become compromised when they're under a lot of stress. And so in our case this year, we had a lot of very wet conditions early on and a lot of ponding in the fields. And so that predisposed a lot of these plants to some of those stalk rots. But also it leads to secondary problems. We had a lot of nitrogen leaching, for instance, and a lot of nitrogen deficiency. And when we get an imbalance of nitrogen and some of the other nutrients, it can lead to problems later on like stalk rots. In addition, high planting populations and our very high yielding hybrids can also be ones that might be hit with stalk rots, because those plants are programmed to fill grain at all cost. And if they've had a lot of leaf loss caused by diseases or hail or insects, it will actually contribute to stalk loss because the plants will cannibalize the stalk tissue.
You mentioned this, but what are the management options for producers?
So management options are some of the things that we're already doing. Well, we all try to reduce the stress in the crop throughout the year. Some of those things, though, we can have an influence on, and so there are hybrids that are more resistant and more susceptible than others. And so if stalk rots are a consistent problem for some of our producers, they can make their hybrid selections during the fall and winter for the next year for problem fields, making sure to pick hybrids that have more resistance to the specific stalk rot diseases that they fight.
And Tamra, finally, what other diseases are out there right now?
Well, we've had a flush recently of some of the foliar diseases that we've been watching throughout the season. And so during the season, we've seen a lot of gray leaf spot, fungal disease, but we've also had the bacterial leaf streak disease that's out there. Unfortunately, they do look a lot alike. If anyone has any doubt about what they have, now's the time to finally get a diagnosis on that so that they can make better decisions for next year. In addition, we've also seen a flare-up of the southern rust here at the end, but we haven't seen much benefit when we make fungicide applications after dent.
On the Market Journal website, we'll link to Tamra's recent Crop Watch article containing more information about stalk rots. The USDA's next crop progress report will include the season's first look at soybean harvest completion across the country. But even before the crop is out, Nebraska Extension's Nathan Mueller says growers can be looking at making variety selections for soybeans for 2017. Nathan says this time of year can be especially beneficial because certain companies may offer early seed discounts. We talked with Nathan Wednesday here at Husker Harvest Days and began by asking why soybean selection is such an important decision for farmers.
If you just look at the potential profitability and some of the decisions you make on a regular basis, we know from third-party trials that the yield difference can be about 15 bushel difference between the best performing and poorest performing. So even if you get half that difference, 8 bushels in the soybean price, you're looking at $60 bushel per acre, or $60 an acre swing. So, and the price of that seed of those between those different units might only be $5, $8. So you only need about a bushel to cover the difference. So it's a decision we make every year, and there's some things we can do to help make a more informed decision about selecting our soybean varieties for our farms.
Let's talk about some of the information that's available. How can yield records help you?
Yeah, yield records, so there's a couple different sources. There's your on-farm yield records, right? So when you're out in the field looking at the yield monitor data and we'll get your weigh tickets at the end, how did the varieties do on your farm this year? The second is going to be looking at company data, right? They have lots of plots. They also have their own company information that they can share those results with you of what's performing well in your region. And then the third is third-party trials. So whether it's University of Nebraska, South Dakota State, Iowa State, and FIRST trials are all third-party companies that test on behalf of companies. And so that's another good source of information. So again, looking at both multiple locations and multiple years if you can for some of the varieties is going to be really important. Just using all the data you have to make a more informed decision.
How can you make sure that the varieties you're selecting are matching the needs of a field that may have had problems in the past?
Yeah, I mean, we know that not all of our fields are the same, right? We know certain parts of a field are even different, right? And that's why we're using precision ag, looking at how we can manage on a per acre basis or less. So knowing like a field that has SDS might have SDS in the river bottom, you don't on your uplands yet. So selecting for SDS resistance in your variety is going to be important. So you're going to have to weigh that with the yield records as well. Another case might be you've just manured the field. You put feedlot manure, biosolids, whatever. So lodging, right? A lot of excess growth is a concern. So you might look at lodging scores for those, right? So trying to match up those traits with each individual field. And so to do that, you can't just pick 1 or 2 varieties for your farm. I mean, you get to choose what companies you want to work with if you want to work with one or multiple, but when it comes down to varieties, I know it's easy to have a bulk unit or a seed tender with 1 or 2 varieties, but really to match up the traits to each of your fields, you're probably going to need more than just 2 soybean varieties.
What's your recommendation on selecting maturities?
Yeah, maturities is a big one, and that goes along with selecting more than one variety, right? We know that Nebraska rainfall and temperatures, there's lots of swings. We're at Husker harvest days, and it's cool, and last year was hot. So the same thing happens in August. So the first 2 weeks of August might be hot and dry. That's going to negatively probably impact earlier maturing soybeans than a later one. But the next year, it could be a hot, dry end of August that's going to impact the seed fill on a later maturing one. So you don't know that up front. So spread out your maturities, whether, in my area that might be ranging from a 2.4 on the early side to a 3.4 on the late side. And so spreading that maturity out so all your eggs aren't in one basket. So when we have those short, hot periods in August, which really drive soybean yield, we have a little bit of diversity there against that risk.
So finally, as farmers go through the field at harvest and they see that maybe a number doesn't do so well and they think about going away from it, or one number does really well and they think I'll go all in on this next year, how do you weigh 1 year versus a lot of information?
Yeah, some varieties have really been selected for dry land stress conditions, right? And then all of a sudden you get a lot of rain. It gets big and tall, maybe doesn't yield as much as you thought. So you need to talk to your company about some of those qualities associated with the varieties, why maybe it didn't do well this year, why you might still want to go to it next year even though it didn't do well this year, maybe it was an abnormal year. So you need to take that into consideration as well.
Nathan has more information about variety selection available on his website at croptechcafe.org. We'll also link to that on the Market Journal homepage. The September Nebraska farmer says in addition to the hard red winter wheat Brent Robertson harvested this summer, about 1/3 of his wheat was hard white wheat. After a drop in size about 10 years ago, this month's magazine says hard white wheat is making a comeback in southwest Nebraska, including near Elsie, where Robertson farms. You can read more about hard white wheat in western Nebraska and the demand that's driving its increase in the September Nebraska Farmer. We've talked this year about negative returns for cattle producers in the feedlot. Cow-calf operations are also experiencing much lower returns compared with a few years ago. The Sterling Beef Profit Tracker is estimating cow-calf per head margins at $178 this year, with margins dropping to about $82 a head in 2017. Those returns are far below 2015's mark of $433 a head and 2014's level of $518 per animal. At the recent Goodmanson Sandhills Lab open house near Whitman, Nebraska, we talked with Nebraska Extension's Rick Funston about the importance of looking at input costs for those farmers and ranchers.
The margins of profitability are much lower than they've been the last couple of years with record calf prices, so I think people have maybe gotten a little bit complacent about really considering some of the management strategies that they could utilize to decrease production costs.
Let's talk about a few areas. Let's start with cow costs. How might you be able to decrease your cow costs?
So obviously the biggest cost of any phase of beef production is feed. And if we can decrease the amount of harvested forage, in most cases we can decrease cow costs. One of the cheapest options we have, if we can find sources, is maybe taking cows to graze corn residue fields.
How hard is it to find those kinds of places then here?
Well, we only utilize something less than 20% of the entire corn residue in the states. Unfortunately, a lot of that unutilized residue lies outside of areas where there's a lot of cows in the east.
Is it affordable to, travel that far to get it or to bring it back here?
Yeah, so I think transportation is one of the major costs of adopting that or utilizing that practice, but I think it's still a lot cheaper than banking forage on a ranch with our high grazing costs.
What about winter grazing? How expensive can that be on the operation?
Yeah, so that's what we're talking about utilizing corn residue for, but winter grazing of dormant forages, if you will, that certainly is an option, but it comes at a cost that's got to be somewhere close to summer grazing costs, which are extremely high in this state, because at best you could probably graze a pasture very early in the spring, provided you get adequate forage, but you can't graze it normally and then expect to graze it all winter.
How important is heifer development when you start thinking about
so that heifer replacement enterprise is very costly to a beef operation, because you have essentially an animal that's not productive until she's 2 years old, has a calf, is going to wean a lighter calf. So our approach has been to treat that heifer, and we saw talks today about the stalker enterprise, treat that heifer like a stalker, run her like a yearling that you would, and then expose them all for a very short time. And then that female that's not pregnant is a potential profit center, because you don't have a lot of money in her.
Is there a discussion about which cows you're retaining, open cows to retain, whether or not to keep them on the operation?
Of the open females? Yeah. So we've done quite a bit of work, especially where we were rebuilding the cow herd, where bred females that were pregnant anytime were at a premium. So the last several years here at the ranch, we've actually taken any female young, not an older cow, which are generally not open anyway, and taken those younger females, expose them for the November breeding season, that'd be a fall cavern, and sell them the next year. And we did a paper on that, and every year but the drought year it was profitable to do that. We're somewhat reevaluating that this year, but we have a couple things that have changed quite a bit. Cull cow prices are down, all cattle prices are down. I guess the question remains, what will these bred females for fall calving be worth? A lot of them went down to Texas and Oklahoma, where they're still rebuilding their cow herds, so they may be worth more. It might be a profitable venture again this year.
Now, with this week's weather forecast, here's Nebraska Extension ag climatologist Al Dutcher.
Well, folks, here again for the weekly forecast. Of course, during this last week, we had that frontal boundary that moved slowly across the state during the early to midweek period, brought cloudy conditions to the state. We did see some fairly decent precipitation amounts come out of eastern Nebraska on Tuesday. And as you move to western Nebraska, most of those came in on Monday, so they didn't have a real impact on Husker harvest days as much as we had seen cloudy conditions. We really didn't see much more than a little bit of misting action and a few light sprinkles on Tuesday. And then, of course, as the main front and the cold front itself moved across the state on Thursday, we did see some heavy thunderstorm activity develop in portions of north central and northeast Nebraska, with a little bit of training effect as the front kind of wound up a little bit and slowed down. We actually seen a tornado report come out of Dodge County, and of course some flooding situation developing in some of the areas that had received heavier precipitation earlier in the week. Farther westward, of course, we need to see some precipitation. Many of these systems have been hitting the eastern part of the state at the expense of the west, and unfortunately, this is the time of the year we would love to see some moisture build up before we go into our strong fall conditions in anticipation of the wheat that will be planted as we go through the month. More importantly, one of the things that has come out with our long lead outlooks is that CPC is looking at the equatorial Pacific and has come to the conclusion, based on their models, that this La Niña projected event is not going to materialize, and they backed off their watch. So they have assigned a probability level of around 35% for this event, and typically we would expect about a 33% randomly. So just about 2% above normal, and about a 65% chance that we will be in neutral conditions. However, our Australian counterparts have already indicated that the La Niña threshold, based on the surface pressure differential, is actually meeting La Niña conditions. So this would not be the first time that our CPC, the Climate Prediction Center, has underestimated a potential event. And the last time they did this was, again, with the El Nino event a couple of years ago, where they were projecting a very strong event that didn't materialize until a year later. So we'll wait to see. This next 30-day period is the most important period for this area. So you do see below normal sea surface temperature. We've not seen much of a change. We have again seen this blob of above normal conditions develop in the Gulf of Alaska, and this will impede the ability for this region to cool down significantly, but it would not surprise me in the least bit that this will be a slow process building this fall, and may actually continue building, sort of like our last El Nino event, which was a multi-year event, built slowly the first year, only to strengthen additionally during the second year. So we'll pay attention and we'll keep you updated on this process. Currently what is going on is that the trough that brought the severe weather to the state earlier in the week has now progressed to the upper Great Lakes region, and we have a couple quick moving short waves in the middle of the atmosphere that are rolling across the state. At most, we expect a few scattered clouds, but there is that outside chance for some precipitation across extreme eastern and southeastern Nebraska, a few passing showers, no organized precipitation. And that will probably primarily be after dark and continue on into tomorrow morning during the first half of the day as that energy starts to pull away from us and impacts more of the eastern and central corn belt. In its wake, we'll start to see ridging building in, and our temperatures will still remain below seasonal norms, but we'll start to see a gradual warm up on Sunday, and more importantly, as we get into Monday, the ridge starts building in, and we'll see our temperatures going back up to seasonal temperatures, mid to upper 70s to low 80s, depending on location, warmer conditions to the south. As we go into Tuesday, the ridge starts to build even farther to the north, so we'll probably be seeing widespread 80s across the southern half of the state, and maybe an isolated 90 will develop across southwest and south central Nebraska. But more importantly, if we're going to see 90-degree weather, I think it's going to be on Wednesday as we start to get a southwest flow in the upper layers of the atmosphere, bringing some moisture in from the Gulf of Mexico, and we'll start to see some thunderstorm development along the front range, and some of that might carry into extreme western Nebraska. But more importantly, as we get into Thursday, the trough starts to make a bigger inroads into the northwest. That will really start to funnel our winds from the southwest, and we could actually see temperatures widespread into the upper 80s before we start to see that front approach as we get into Friday and start to see thunderstorm development occur across the high plains, and that will start to carry in this next weekend. So in terms of the 8 to 14-day forecast, normal conditions with this front coming in, and in terms of precipitation, CPC is actually forecasting below normal precipitation, but the latest models are showing a widespread precipitation event for much of the central plains. And in terms of the 30-day forecast for the month of October, this is a preliminary look. Above normal temperatures for the northern half of the country, in the west and the east. In our region, the lighter chances for above normal temperatures with near normal to our south. And in terms of precipitation, there does look to be a wide expansive area covering Kansas, southern half of Nebraska, where we'll see above normal precipitation. And if it's going to occur, most likely it's going to be in the first half of the month, tailing off during the second half of the month.
Thanks, Al. Today's interviews are available individually on the Market Journal website and through the Market Journal mobile app. They include information on the USDA September Crop Report, Stalk Rot Issues, selecting soybean varieties, and cow input costs. As always, you can keep up with Market Journal during the week by following us on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. Next week, Frayne Olson will be our market analyst, and DTN's Bryce Anderson will preview potential weather conditions during harvest. Until then, thanks for watching. From Husker Harvest Days, I'm Jeff Wilkerson. We'll see you next week.
Join Market Journal online at marketjournal.unl.edu. You can also follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine, and major funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Corn Board. Market Journal is produced by the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources.